All right, so we're ready to help you push past that intermediate English plateau. You know that spot where you're not a beginner anymore, but you're not quite fluent either. We've got tons of notes and articles for you today. This deep dive is all about ditching the textbooks and getting into the practical stuff, the tips and tricks that really work.
And what's so interesting is we're not just dealing with theoretical advice here. We have Emma's actual experience to draw from. She successfully navigated this phase, and her insights offer like a blueprint for anyone striving for fluency.
Exactly. It's one thing to know the rules, but to actually see someone apply them and succeed, that's gold. And we're going to unpack Emma's journey together. I'll highlight some of the key strategies she used. And you could break down why they work and how our listener can adapt these methods for themselves.
Sounds good. I'm eager to dive into the specifics.
Okay, so Emma's whole approach is about active engagement. She didn't just passively absorb English. She dove headfirst into what she calls total immersion. Think podcasts blasting in the background, movies on repeat, even talking to herself in English.
Now, this idea of immersion, it gets thrown around a lot. But what's powerful about her approach is the intensity of it. She wasn't just casually listening. She created an environment where English was almost unavoidable. And this constant exposure, it does something really interesting to your brain. It starts to pick up on the subtleties of the language, the rhythm, the intonation, even the cultural context behind certain phrases.
It's like training your ear to be on high alert, constantly absorbing the nuances of English. Instead of just understanding the basic meaning, you start to grasp the feeling behind the words.
Exactly. It's like the difference between looking at a painting and actually stepping inside of it.
I love that analogy. So tell me, how does this stepping inside the painting work in practice? I'm sure our listener is curious about the specifics of Emma's immersion techniques.
Well, one technique she swore by was watching movies with English subtitles. It sounds simple, but think about it. You're not only hearing the language, you're also seeing it spelled out. So you're making those connections between sound and written form. And this is especially helpful with pronunciation and recognizing new vocabulary.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I remember trying to learn Spanish by watching shows with subtitles, and it did help me pick up some phrases. But Emma didn't stop at passive immersion, right? She talked about active listening techniques as well.
Absolutely. She was a huge advocate for what's called shadowing. It's basically mimicking what you hear, almost like you're the actor's echo. You listen to a phrase and then immediately repeat it, trying to match the pronunciation, intonation, even the pauses.
This reminds me of how musicians learn to play by ear. They listen intently to a song and then try to reproduce it note for note. You're essentially doing the same thing with language.
That's a great comparison. And what's fascinating about shadowing is that it forces you to engage multiple senses. You're not just passively listening, you're actively using your voice and your ears to internalize those sounds. And this helps bridge the gap between understanding and actually speaking, which is often a major hurdle for language learners.
It sounds incredibly effective, but I imagine it takes a lot of discipline and focus. Did Emma mention any particular challenges with this technique?
Well, she did say it felt awkward at first, which is natural, when you're mimicking someone else's speech. But she emphasized pushing past that initial discomfort and sticking with it. The more she practiced, the more natural and intuitive it became.
It's like any skill, really. The initial awkwardness fades away with practice and repetition. But let's move on to another aspect of Emma's journey: vocabulary. Now, we all know those endless vocabulary lists can be a bit daunting. How did Emma approach building her word bank?
She took a very different approach. She ditched the rote memorization and focused on learning new words in context. So she'd pick them up from conversations, TV shows, books, and even jot them down in a vocabulary journal. But it wasn't just about writing the word down. She'd also write down the entire sentence or phrase where she encountered it.
Ah, so she was capturing the word in its natural habitat, so to speak.
Precisely. And this is key for a few reasons. First, it gives you a deeper understanding of the word's meaning. You see how it's used in different situations, which helps you build a more nuanced vocabulary. Second, it helps with memory retention. Our brains are wired to remember things better when they're associated with a story or a situation or an emotion.
It's like learning a new dance move. You can memorize the steps from a diagram, but you really internalize it when you practice it with a partner in the context of a song and a rhythm.
That's a great way to put it. And this leads us to another crucial element, the importance of actually speaking. Emma stressed that you can't just passively absorb language. You need to actively use it.
She talked about joining online language exchange programs and even practicing thinking in English throughout the day.
Both of those are fantastic strategies. Language exchange programs provide a safe and supportive environment to practice with native speakers. which is invaluable for building confidence and fluency. And practicing thinking in English, that's where the magic happens.
It sounds challenging.
It can be, especially at first. But the more you do it, the less you'll rely on translating everything in your head, and the smoother your speech will become.
It's like learning to drive in the beginning. You're consciously thinking about every action, the clutch, the gas, the brakes. But eventually it becomes second nature, and you're free to focus on the road ahead.
That's a perfect analogy. And speaking of overcoming challenges, let's talk about Emma's approach to grammar. She had a really interesting take on how to master the rules without getting bogged down in textbooks.
I'm all ears. This is something I think a lot of learners struggle with.
Well, Emma believed in learning grammar organically through real-life usage, so she paid close attention to how native speakers structured their sentences in conversations, movies, books. She also used interactive grammar apps that provided practice in context, which made it more engaging and less like those dreaded grammar drills.
So instead of memorizing a bunch of rules, she was absorbing the patterns of the language naturally.
Exactly. It's like learning to play an instrument by ear. You might not know the technical names for all the chords, but you can still create beautiful music by listening carefully and imitating what you hear.
It sounds like a much more intuitive and enjoyable way to learn grammar. But speaking of mimicking, let's move on to pronunciation, another area where Emma had some valuable insights.
Absolutely. She was a big believer in mimicry. She would listen intently to native speakers and try to reproduce their speech patterns, paying close attention to the nuances of pronunciation.
I bet that was a valuable exercise. Did she have any specific techniques she used for honing her pronunciation?
She did. She would record herself speaking, and then compare her pronunciation to that of native speakers, noting areas that needed improvement. She also found it helpful to break words down into syllables, focusing on stress and intonation patterns.
So she was treating pronunciation almost like a musical performance, focusing on the rhythm and flow of the language.
That's a great way to think about it. And this highlights the importance of being attuned to those subtle details of spoken English.
It's like an actor mastering a new accent. They have to pay close attention to the nuances of how words are formed and delivered.
Exactly. It's all about fine-tuning your ear and your voice to match the patterns of native speech. But there's one more crucial ingredient in Emma's success that we haven't touched on yet.
I'm guessing you're talking about motivation and consistency. After all, you can have the best techniques in the world, but without those, it's hard to make any real progress.
You're absolutely right. Emma emphasized the importance of setting small, achievable goals and celebrating those wins, whether it was mastering 5 new words a day or watching a short English video without subtitles. Those small victories kept her motivated and on track.
It's like those fitness trackers that track your steps and calories burned. It's so much easier to stay motivated when you can see those small increments of progress adding up.
Exactly. And just like with fitness, consistency is key. Making English a part of your daily routine, even if it's just for a few minutes each day, can lead to significant improvement over time.
It's like compound interest. Small, regular investments can accumulate into something much larger in the long run.
I love that analogy, and it perfectly encapsulates the power of consistency in language learning.
So we've covered a lot of ground, exploring the various strategies Emma used to conquer that intermediate plateau. But I want to pause here and ask you, what's the biggest takeaway you want our listener to grasp from this part of her journey?
I think the most important takeaway is that language learning is a holistic process. It's not just about memorizing vocabulary or cramming grammar rules. It's about immersing yourself in the language, actively engaging with it, and using it as a tool for communication and connection.
It's about embracing the messiness and the challenges, celebrating the small victories, and constantly seeking out opportunities to learn and grow.
Exactly. And that's what's so inspiring about Emma's story. She shows us that fluency isn't some unattainable goal. It's a journey that anyone can embark on with the right mindset and approach.
It's so encouraging to hear that fluency is truly achievable, for anyone who's willing to put in the work. And I think what's really resonating with me is this idea, that Emma emphasizes finding what works for you. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to language learning.
Absolutely. And it's refreshing to see how she embraced that idea of experimentation. She didn't limit herself to those traditional methods. She tried different techniques. She adapted them to her learning style. She created a personalized system that worked for her. And I think that's key. It's about being proactive and taking ownership of your learning journey.
So it's not just about blindly following someone else's advice. It's about, finding your own rhythm, creating a learning experience that's effective and enjoyable. Now, I know Emma also shared some practical tips that our listeners can start using right away. Can you walk us through those?
Of course. So her first tip is all about creating an English bubble around yourself. It's a great way to describe that immersive environment we talked about earlier. So she recommends listening to English music, podcasts, even audiobooks as much as possible. The idea is to surround yourself with the sounds of the language, even if you're not actively focusing on every word.
It's like marinating your brain in English.
Exactly. And this passive exposure can have a surprisingly powerful effect. Your brain starts to pick up those patterns and rhythms subconsciously, making it easier to process spoken English later on.
So it's almost like you're laying the foundation for more active learning. And speaking of active learning, Emma's second tip is all about taking action and actually speaking the language.
Yes, she stressed the importance of making speaking a daily habit, even if it's just for a few minutes at a time. So she suggests talking to yourself in English, narrating your actions, even having those imaginary conversations.
That might sound a little silly at first, but I can see how it would help break down that fear of speaking. Did she mention any other ways to incorporate speaking practice into a daily routine?
She did. She was a big advocate for language exchange partners. So finding someone to practice with, even online, can be incredibly beneficial. It gives you a chance to apply what you've learned in a real-world setting and get feedback from a native speaker.
It's like having a personal trainer for your English skills.
Yeah.
And her third tip, if I remember correctly, is all about embracing those inevitable stumbles along the way.
You're absolutely right. Emma emphasized the importance of not being afraid to make mistakes. In fact, she encouraged learners to see mistakes as valuable learning opportunities. It's through those slip-ups that we identify, those areas where we need to improve.
It's so easy to get discouraged when you make mistakes, especially in the beginning. But reframing them as stepping stones, as part of the process, can be incredibly empowering.
Absolutely. It's a much healthier mindset for language learning.
Yeah.
It takes the pressure off perfection and allows you to focus on progress, not just results.
So to recap, immerse yourself in English practice speaking every day and don't be afraid to make mistakes. These are such simple yet powerful principles.
They are. And what's great is that they're accessible to everyone you know, regardless of your learning style or budget. You don't need fancy software or expensive tutors to implement these tips.
It's about taking ownership of your learning and creating a system that works for you. Now, before we move on, I want to touch on something we mentioned earlier, finding what works best for you. It's great to have these tips, but how can our listener figure out which techniques will resonate with them the most?
That's a great question. It's all about self-awareness and a bit of experimentation. Try different approaches, see what feels comfortable and engaging, and don't be afraid to adapt things as you go.
So it's not a one-and-done situation. It's about constantly evaluating and refining your approach as you learn and grow.
Precisely. And remember, there's no right or wrong answer. What works for one person might not work for another. The key is to find what clicks for you and make it your own.
Now, speaking of finding what clicks, let's dive into some specific areas where English learners often hit roadblocks: grammar and pronunciation.
All right, let's tackle those. What specifically would you like to explore?
Well, I think a lot of people get intimidated by grammar rules. They see those long lists of verb tenses and prepositions and they just feel overwhelmed. What's Emma's take on tackling grammar effectively?
She had a very practical approach to grammar. She believed in focusing on the most common patterns and structures, first mastering those before moving on to the more complex rules. And she also emphasized the importance of learning grammar in context rather than just memorizing, those abstract rules.
So it's not about cramming your head full of grammatical terms. It's about understanding how those rules actually work in real-life conversations and writing.
Exactly. And she also encouraged learners to pay attention to the grammar used by native speakers. Listen to how they structure their sentences. Notice how they use verb tenses and prepositions.
It's like learning the grammar organically by osmosis.
That's a great way to put it. It's about absorbing the patterns of the language naturally through exposure and observation. And this leads us to pronunciation, another area that can feel daunting for learners.
Yes, I know a lot of people get hung up on perfecting their accent. What's Emma's perspective on approaching pronunciation?
She had a very balanced view. She recognized that having a perfect native-like accent isn't essential for effective communication. However, she did emphasize the importance of clear, comprehensible pronunciation.
So it's not about sounding exactly like a native speaker, it's about being understood clearly.
Exactly. And she offered some great tips for improving pronunciation. She stressed the importance of listening carefully to native speakers, paying attention to how they pronounce words and phrases.
It's that idea of mimicry again.
Exactly. And she also recommended breaking words down into syllables, focusing on stress patterns and intonation. This can help you identify those subtle nuances of pronunciation and improve your clarity.
It's like breaking down a dance move into smaller steps. It makes it easier to learn and master.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of mastering skills, let's circle back to this idea of motivation and consistency. We know they're crucial, but how can learners maintain momentum, especially when they hit those inevitable plateaus?
That's a great question. It's easy to get discouraged when you feel like you're not making progress.
Absolutely. Emma had some great strategies for staying motivated. She was a big believer in setting realistic goals, breaking down larger goals into smaller, more manageable chunks.
That makes so much sense. It's much less daunting to focus on learning 5 new words a day than trying to cram an entire vocabulary list.
Exactly. And she also emphasized the importance of finding ways to make the learning process enjoyable.
It's like finding a workout routine you actually look forward to.
Precisely. If you're enjoying the process, you're more likely to stick with it.
So finding ways to make language learning fun and engaging is crucial for maintaining motivation. And this brings us to an important question. What does it actually mean to be fluent in a language?
That's a great question, and it's one that doesn't have a simple answer. Fluency can mean different things to different people. For some, it might mean being able to have effortless conversations on a wide range of topics. For others, it might mean being able to read and write with ease.
So there's no single definition of fluency. It's more about finding a level of proficiency that allows you to communicate effectively and achieve your goals.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that fluency is a journey, not a destination. It's a process of continuous learning and improvement.
It's about embracing the challenges and celebrating the small victories along the way.
Absolutely. And speaking of celebrating victories, let's shift gears and talk about ways to track progress and measure success.
This is something I think a lot of learners struggle with. It's hard to know if you're actually improving when you're so immersed in the process.
You're right, it's easy to lose sight of how far you've come. Emma had some insightful suggestions for tracking progress. She was a big advocate for self-assessment. She encouraged learners to regularly reflect on their strengths and weaknesses, noting areas where they've improved and identifying areas that still need work.
So it's about developing that self-awareness and taking an active role in monitoring your own progress.
Exactly. And she also suggested setting specific, measurable goals.
This goes back to that idea of breaking down larger goals into smaller, more achievable steps.
Exactly. For example, instead of aiming to be fluent, you might set a goal to have a 10-minute conversation with a native speaker about my hobbies.
That's much more concrete and measurable. And it provides a clear sense of accomplishment when you achieve it.
Absolutely. And speaking of accomplishment, let's talk about ways to celebrate those wins, both big and small.
Celebrating successes is so important. It helps to maintain motivation and reinforces the positive aspects of the learning journey.
You're absolutely right. Emma emphasized the importance of acknowledging your progress and rewarding yourself for your efforts. Whether it's treating yourself to a nice meal, buying a new book in English, or simply taking a break to relax and enjoy your accomplishments, it's crucial to celebrate those milestones.
Those celebrations serve as positive reinforcement, reminding us that we're on the right track and capable of achieving our goals.
Exactly. And they help to create a positive association with language learning, making it something we look forward to rather than dread.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, exploring a wide range of strategies and techniques for conquering that intermediate plateau and moving towards fluency.
It's been a fascinating discussion. I think we've touched on some really key points that will be valuable for our listeners.
I agree. And I want to make sure we leave our listeners with a clear sense of direction and some actionable takeaways. What are some key points you'd like to reiterate before we wrap up this part of our deep dive?
Well, first and foremost, I want to emphasize that fluency is achievable for anyone who's willing to put in the effort. It's not about being naturally gifted or having a perfect ear for languages. It's about consistent effort, a positive attitude, and a willingness to experiment and find what works best for you.
It's about embracing the journey and celebrating the small victories along the way.
Exactly. And I also want to reiterate the importance of personalized learning. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. What works for one person might not work for another. It's crucial to experiment with different techniques, find what clicks for you, and create a learning system that fits your individual needs and preferences.
It's about taking ownership of your learning and being proactive in shaping your own path to fluency.
Absolutely. And finally, I want to encourage listeners to embrace those mistakes. They're not failures, they're opportunities to learn and grow.
They're valuable feedback that helps us identify areas where we need to improve. And each mistake we overcome brings us one step closer to fluency.
Exactly. So don't be afraid to make mistakes, learn from them, and keep moving forward.
Those are some great takeaways. Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a little challenge. We talked about the importance of self-assessment and tracking progress. What if this week you tried recording yourself speaking English for a few minutes?
That's a fantastic idea. It's a great way to get an objective view of your own speaking skills and identify areas where you can focus your efforts.
Exactly. Choose a topic you're comfortable with, set a timer for 5 minutes, and just talk. Then listen back to the recording and take note of your pronunciation, fluency, grammar, and vocabulary.
It's like holding up a mirror to your English-speaking self. You might be surprised by what you discover.
Exactly. It's a great way to gain insights into your strengths and weaknesses and identify areas where you can continue to improve.
And remember, the goal isn't perfection, it's progress. Every step you take brings you closer to fluency.
So to our listeners, I encourage you to take on this challenge this week. Record yourself speaking English and see what you discover. You might just amaze yourself with how far you've come.
And remember, we're here to support you on your English learning journey. We have tons of resources on our website, including links to those language exchange programs and interactive grammar apps that Emma mentioned.
Don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions or if you just want to share your progress. We love hearing from our listeners.
Absolutely. We're all in this together. Now let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll wrap up our deep dive with some final thoughts and inspiration.
Okay, we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into conquering that intermediate English plateau. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling pretty energized after exploring all of Emma's tips and your insights.
It's been a really engaging discussion. I think what strikes me most is how Emma's journey highlights the importance of mindset. It's not just about, those techniques you use. It's about approaching language learning with curiosity, a willingness to experiment, and a healthy dose of self-compassion.
It's about viewing those inevitable stumbles as opportunities for growth, not setbacks. I think that's such a powerful message for anyone feeling stuck or discouraged on their language learning journey.
Absolutely. And I love how she emphasizes the idea of personalized learning. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. The key is to find what resonates with you, adapt techniques to your learning style, and create a system that feels both effective and enjoyable.
It's about taking ownership of your learning and becoming the architect of your own fluency journey.
Yeah.
Now, before we say goodbye, I want to leave our listener with one final thought to ponder. We talked a lot about those external techniques, immersion, active listening, speaking practice. But what about the internal game? How can we cultivate the right mindset to stay motivated and make consistent progress?
That's a brilliant question. I think one of the most powerful things you can do is cultivate a sense of playfulness. Approach language learning as an adventure, a journey of discovery. Don't be afraid to experiment, make mistakes, and have fun with it.
It's like remembering that learning a language isn't just about picking boxes or achieving a certain score. It's about connecting with another culture, expanding your horizons, and opening yourself up to new experiences.
Exactly. And when you approach it with that sense of curiosity and playfulness, the journey becomes just as rewarding as the destination.
That's such a beautiful way to frame it. So to our listener, we encourage you to embrace that spirit of adventure. Dive into the world of English with an open mind and a playful heart. And remember, we're here to support you every step of the way.
Absolutely. We're cheering you on. Now go out there and conquer that intermediate plateau. We know you can do it.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone. Happy learning.